So now today we're going to be going into the English Restoration era in theater history. Thank God we're back in England and I can have a ale. So we're going to start on your notes, your board notes that I have there. If you see at the beginning there, it says William Davenant writing plays in 1628. So William Davenant was a playwright. He was born about 1605 or 1606 in Oxford. And he started writing plays around 1628. And they were sort of a different style than they were in the Renaissance. But it really didn't have a major effect yet. He'll have another major effect real soon, and we'll talk about that. Shortly after that, 1637, another playwright comes around. He'd been writing plays for a little while. His name is Thomas Killigrew. But he wrote a play called The Parson's Wedding, and that actually began to gain him some notoriety as a playwright. So now you've got two main playwrights there right now. A third, actually, Ben Jonson, still considered to be one of the greatest playwrights since Shakespeare. But as you see on your list here, he dies pretty quickly. So you've got two major playwrights that are going to continue through the Restoration, and that will be William Davenant and Thomas Killigrew. But they're actually going to be known more as theater managers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. 1637, also you see a man by the name of John Ogilby, granted a license by Charles I to open a theater in Dublin, and he became Ireland's master of revels. So, 1638, Ben Jonson dies. Remember, Ben Jonson was a contemporary of Shakespeare's. He dies. He was the poet laureate, which means he wrote all of the court masques. That title was then given to Davenant, and he continued that until the Civil War, which you see is next on your list there. Now, the Civil War started in 1642. Let's discuss a little bit about why that happened and how it happened. This is very important in theater history in general. All right. So, a real quick sort of down and dirty discussion of the Civil War was that Charles I ran the monarchy pretty much ignoring Parliament for many years. And he then had to come to them to ask for funding. And unfortunately, Parliament at that point in time was pretty pissed off about it. And they told him that they weren't going to give him money until they had a say in the government. He told them effectively to piss off. I'm probably paraphrasing it at the moment, but it angered them further, and it turned into Civil War. Now, the people on the side of the Parliament were the Puritans. And they sort of effectively went around to theaters and said, we're going to close down the Civil War because there's a lot of things going on, people shooting people in the streets, so on and so forth, so we're going to close theaters down just for everyone's safety. We'll reopen them when this is all done. And they had a good idea that they were going to win the Civil War, so it was an easy way for them to actually permanently close theater, which is what they've wanted since the beginning here, is to close theaters down. So in 1644, if you recall, they tore down the Globe Theater. And they will begin tearing down the rest of the theaters all through the process of the Civil War. During the Civil War, they began to control more and more power as Charles I's factions were losing. By 1649, Charles I is beheaded, and that ends the Civil War. The Parliament/Puritans won. So what ends up happening at this point in time is they appoint a dictator. A few years after they won the Civil War, Parliament's running the government, but they need someone who's a figurehead who will take charge, and they appoint a man by the name of Oliver Cromwell. And he becomes the dictator of England, pretty much, which is kind of odd because the Parliament was already upset at the king for sort of being dictatorial and not giving him power. And they bring in Oliver Cromwell, and he kind of does about the same thing, although I think he connects with Parliament a little bit better. He runs it until 1658 when he dies, and it is then passed on to his son Richard. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that transition tends to lead to the Restoration a little bit further down the road here. So during this time, there's no theater. Theater's not allowed. It's illegal. Actors can be apprehended as rogues because the Puritan Parliament was allowed to pass kind of pretty much what it wanted to, and they wanted the theaters closed. So they passed this law in 1649 that all actors would be apprehended as rogues. So Davenant really couldn't put up plays. It was illegal. So what he does is he puts up an operatic production, First Day's Entertainment at Rutland House. And then after that, he puts up another one called The Siege of Rhodes. And that one actually is interesting because it's the first clear use of Italianate scenery designed by a guy named John Webb, who, by the way, was a student of Inigo Jones, if you remember him from your English Renaissance. And he becomes the foremost scenic designer in Restoration theater. John Webb does. So, why is Davenant getting away with all of this? Well, he's getting away with this because they are considered musical entertainments. Therefore, they're not theater. And they would have little dramatic acting bits between the acts, kind of like the court masque were sort of intermission pieces. They kind of did the same thing, only flip-flopped it. They did the opera and the lavish stuff as the main entertainment because that wasn't illegal, and then they threw little dramatic skits in between the acts in order to still do plays. And, leave it to actors to create loopholes. So he continues to do this. Between 1658 and 1659, he produced 3 more of these. And he actually took them out of his house. The first two, First Day's Entertainment at Rutland House and Siege of Rhodes, which were the first 2 productions he did, were produced literally at his house. These 3 productions between 1658 and 1659 were actually produced at a theater. Okay. They were produced at the Cockpit, which was not a theater. They actually had to build a proscenium arch for these shows because it didn't have one. Because the Cockpit was an area for cockfighting, and the bear baiting places were still open as well. Apparently, as far as the Puritans are concerned, Jesus hates theater, but is okay with cockfighting and bear baiting. So those structures still existed because they didn't tear those down. So the theater people started utilizing those to put on their plays. And again, they were still illegal. These were plays, and they were illegal. But by 1658, Cromwell had died. His son took over, and definitely by 1659, the military really had no use for Richard Cromwell. Literally, they felt that he was so incompetent that he couldn't even pour piss out of a boot with instructions on the heel. So there was no respect. There was a tear now between the military and Parliament. It was very clear that the monarchy was going to be restored, so they didn't even bother with something as menial as theaters going on, and it's illegal. By 1660, because of all this rift, Charles II, who is the son of Charles I, obviously, returns from France. That's where he ran to hide during the whole Civil War. As a matter of fact, Davenant even fled to France for a little while and stayed with it. And we'll talk about that because some of the English Restoration theater techniques and styles were direct from France. So, looking down at your list again here, when Charles II returned, he gave grants to Davenant and Killigrew to open up theaters. Okay. Killigrew actually opened up the first one, and that was Killigrew opened up the King's Servants at Gibbons Tennis Courts. Now, that's what I'm talking about, okay? The French, as we talked about in the Restoration, where we would sort of refurbish tennis courts into theaters, that's where Davenant and Killigrew learned it. So when Killigrew was handed a patent to open up a theater, and all of them had been torn down, he ran and found an abandoned tennis court, and he turned that into a theater, and that was Gibbons Tennis Court. So that was his company, Gibbons, King's Servants at Gibbons Tennis Court. So the cool thing is these plays also did not have to be licensed by the Master of Revels. That was gone. That whole thing was taken care of, so they could put anything they wanted up on the stage. And 3 years later, Killigrew opened up a new theater called the Theatre Royal at Drury Lane. Yes, it is the Drury Lane where the Muffin Man lives. I've been there. I walked the entire Drury Lane. No Muffin Man. Anyway, Davenant also opened up a theater as well, and he called his the Duke of York's Playhouse at Lincoln's Inn Fields. Lincoln's Inn Fields is what it ends up being known as, and it becomes a prominent theater throughout the Restoration. Right? Davenant worked there for a while, but then he transferred his charter over to another place called Covent Garden. Now, Covent Garden is sort of somewhat central London area, but it's a big shopping area. It's big, sort of, we would kind of consider it like a big farmers market type thing. But in that area, they created a playing space, and then so was a Covent Garden Theatre, and that becomes another one of the major important theaters in the Restoration era, and that's run by Davenant. Okay, it's going to get confusing in a little bit, but I'll try to keep it as clear as I possibly can. All right, so, and the next thing we have after that is, looking over here at my list, 1662, John Ogilvy renews his license. So remember the guy that right before the Civil War happened was like, here's your license to open up a theater and be Ireland's master of revels. And then all of a sudden Civil War, sorry, you can't do that. Well, now that the king came back, he reissued that license to him. So John Ogilvy could now open the Smock Alley, which is still in existence today. And that was the first theater built in Great Britain, which isn't Great Britain yet, technically. It comes that later. But in what we call Great Britain, after the Restoration. So it's the first theater that was built after the Restoration in Ireland, in Great Britain. So I said that Killigrew then opened the Theatre Royal at Drury Lane. That was in 1663. So right away in 1660, he opened his Gibbons Tennis Court, but 3 years later he opened the Theatre Royal at Drury Lane. And we'll get into that when we get into theater architecture. We'll actually talk a little more about it. It's got kind of an interesting and sort of somewhat funny history to it. But it burned down in 1672 and rebuilt as Drury Lane in 1674. It has a few other burnings that we'll talk about. Now, in 1685, Charles II dies. This is important for this reason. His brother, James II, takes the throne, and his brother is like a major ass. And he comes in and he wants to restore the power of the monarchy, which means taking power away from the parliament, and he wants to reestablish Catholicism. Everybody gets pissed off at him, but they're like, you know what, he's not going to last terribly long. And then all of a sudden he has a son. So now he has an heir to carry it on. So Parliament has had enough of this, and they contact his sister, Mary, who is married to a Dutchman who is the Prince of Orange. It was William of Orange. All right? They pretty much sort of contacted the two of them and said, please come in and invade our country and take this over. And so that's what happened. Mary comes in with her husband, William of Orange. They invade England, and they take over the throne. James just flees. And the interesting thing here is that in order for them to be allowed to sort of take over the government and the country, Parliament makes them sign an agreement, turning it into a constitutional monarchy, which means they cannot rule without Parliament. This is what is going to stop all of the religious civil wars that we have been having in England up to this point. Constitutional monarchy is major in this. So, we are at the point down here already where we are at 1693 now. Okay, now you just see this sort of a Christopher Rich takes over Davenant's company. Well, who is he? Well, okay, Christopher Rich and a descendant of William Davenant. His name was Alexander Davenant, Christopher Rich, and a lawyer whose name I don't know, who had seized control of Davenant's company when it fell into financial difficulty. They all take control of this, and now they turn it into a different company name. It was called the United Company, and that was in 1693 when that happened. And in 1695, a couple of major actors from there sort of rebelled and walked out of it. Thomas Betterton was one of them. He's one of the major actors of this era, and he walked away from that company. He and a few others started a new company back in the old Lincoln's Inn Fields, because now Davenant's company is at Covent Garden. They went back to the old theater that they used to have, the Lincoln's Inn Fields, and they called it the New Theater, and they started playing there. They played there till about 1705, and they sort of disbanded and stopped playing at that point. Well, in 1714, the Christopher Rich just sort of tears the old New Theater down and rebuilds it, still calling it the New Theater, because that's what the last troupe in there had called it. So now Christopher Rich and his son John Rich and the old company that they had, the Davenant's company, now actually is spread amongst two different theaters. Davenant had moved the charter to Covent Garden, and then this other members of that troupe ran off to their old theater, and then Christopher Rich, after they disbanded, went, well, if you're not using it, I'm going to tear it down, build it up. Now I've got two theaters. All right, Covent Garden and Lincoln's Inn Fields, two of the most prominent theaters, other than the Drury Lane, in London. So that's what happened there. And that's now we see kind of where we are with regards to the companies in Europe. Now keep in mind also that Charles II not only gave Killigrew and Davenant patents to open up theaters, but they also gave them a theatrical monopoly. Right? That means nobody else can do dramas. And while it gives them that opportunity, what it also tends to do is they tend to start getting a little bit sluggish. They've got no real competition. They don't have to worry about it. So things start to get sort of half-assed, as it were, and it tends to stop this sort of wonderful production values because they don't need to. No one else can stop them. There's no competition. So that really actually hindered early Restoration drama. All right. Now, the next really most interesting thing here is you see on your list here, 1698, Jeremy Collier, a guy, writes a pamphlet called A Short View of the Immorality and Profaneness of the English Stage. He's pretty much sort of hacking on the fact that theater's original intent was, neoclassically wise, right, to teach and to please, and it doesn't do either. It ends in morally incorrect manners. It just pokes fun at people. It's slanderous. There's a slew of things he writes in this pamphlet. Now, keep in mind, I say pamphlet, and you think, well, like a little brochure type thing. That's a pamphlet. Yeah, well, this pamphlet was 300 pages long, which is actually kind of minor compared to another guy by the name of William Prynne, who wrote a pamphlet called Hysteromatrix, also against the theater, which was about 1,000 pages long. So, which of course then prompted a whole bunch of other people to defend the stage, and then these guys to defend their attack on the stage, and so there's all these pamphlets being written around this time attacking or defending the stage. But he was kind of right in what he was saying, so it changed dramatic literature completely. All of a sudden, these things should be ending in morally correct manners, people who are doing bad things should be punished for it, so on and so forth. Early Restoration comedy was sort of based on the concept of man sees pretty woman, wants to go to bed with pretty woman, and the entire show is pretty much some sort of a machination to get her into bed. And quite often she was already married, so it's sort of an affair or something along that line. And it's pretty much the basis of a lot of Restoration drama. Well, that was one of the things that they were attacking in this. And so therefore they kind of had nothing to stand on because they really were writing that way. So the dramatic literature began to change. It would end in more of a morally correct manner. The guys that were trying to get in bed with a married woman and deceive her in order to do so would get caught, get punished, so on and so forth. And there's two writers that we'll talk about that they were very prevalent in that changeover. We'll talk about them when we get to playwrights. So shortly after that, around 1705, Italian opera becomes really, really popular. And it actually begins to replace the sort of English opera that Davenant had created with his musical entertainments that he had done during the Civil War. Actually, Davenant kind of went through after that and continued his English opera. He didn't just stop and start and do plays once the king returned. He continued his opera. Actually turned a number of Shakespeare plays into operas, which I cannot possibly imagine being exciting in any way, shape, or form. But nonetheless, he did do that. So he sort of built English opera. But it gave way to Italian opera by 1705 because that became the most popular. During the 18th century, you have a series of specific types of genres that were popular. Neoclassicism was the dominant mode, but it's kind of difficult to do in some of the Restoration writing that they were doing. But your popular types of dramatic literature were pantomime. It's not the kind of pantomime where you're thinking about, really. Actually, if you think about this, pantomime kind of was the court masks in a full show production. So lavish scenery, lavish costumes, all this kind of really intricate scenery, and so on and so forth. The reason we get the connotation of pantomime that we get is because of John Rich. John Rich basically sort of sets the tone for what pantomime will become in England. And the reason is because he becomes a major actor for pantomimes in this era. But he sucks. He was no good as an actor. His speech was terrible. He just really couldn't speak on stage. So he quit speaking. He took the Harlequin character, which don't confuse it with Commedia dell'arte. Same exact character, but the slapstick was swapped out with like a magic wand where you could touch someone and they turn into a toad. Really lavish, magical things, you know. But he took that Harlequin character and he gave him no more lines. And that was a major character in there. And he struck all the lines because he was horrible at speaking on stage. And so he turned his acting technique of, there was a discussion of somebody, I read an account, a period account, of watching him do they call it a dumb show. Dumb doesn't mean stupid. Dumb at that time meant, well, it still does, actually, can't speak. So someone who is dumb actually is mute, right? So he did the dumb show of a bird breaking out of an egg with the sunlight on it that helps, warm it and allow the chick to break out of it. That this guy just went on and on about. It was amazing. So clearly he was a very good physical actor. He turned that into Harlequin, and that's where you start seeing the changeover from the lavish, fully spoken everything pantomime into what we kind of consider when we say pantomime, right? That's the start of it. So that's what pantomime is back then. Very lavish, very big, not necessarily mute. The other styles we have is ballad opera. Now, ballad opera is it's an opera, of course, hence the name, but it is it usually ends in sort of it's a lighter topic. Actually, it was also known as light opera. So it had not as heavy subject matter. Sometimes it even really ended on a happy note. So that was ballad opera. And they have comic opera also, which is definitely ends on a light note. It's literally comedy, but in opera form. And then they had burlesque. Now, burlesque is not the kind of burlesque that you're thinking about when I say burlesque. All right, it's not talking about pasties and scantily clad women. Burlesque at this time literally was parodies of very serious productions. That's really all it was. Right? So those are the dominant styles at this particular point in time. And so you can see where Italian opera would kind of fit right in and sort of take over. Burlesque and pantomime sort of begin to wane as we see. By 1737, they kind of are passé. 1710, George Friedrich Handel arrives in London, and opera becomes even more popular at this point in time. So really, German opera, Italian opera become really more popular. We talked about this already. I said we're 1714. John Rich takes control of the new theater. His father had rebuilt it, and John Rich goes in as the manager and takes in the new theater. And that's when he started really infusing pantomime into it as a major portion of the playbills, and why pantomime becomes so popular. All right, so again, you've got two kings here. This is a really interesting part about the English monarchy, or the history of English rulers. George I and George II, both German. For almost 50 years, the rulers of England spoke no English. This prompted them to have someone sort of a right-hand man who did speak English, and this man was named Robert Walpole. They denote him as their minister. Robert Walpole becomes England's very first prime minister. That's where that started, because the rulers could not speak or understand any English. So they had to have someone help run it, and that's where the prime minister role comes from. And at that time, I mean, there was enough other problems going on, but right around that time, they're kind of like, everything's kind of been loose around here. So these monopolies, I don't think are even worthwhile anymore. So actors and companies started challenging the monopolies. They started doing shows over here. They would use tennis courts or any kind of theater space they could, or cockpits or bear, and they would just start doing shows, just flouting the monopoly right in the face and saying, who's going to stop us? And that's sort of the start of the degradation of the theatrical monopoly. But at least it was the revival of good theater. Out of that comes a man named John Potter in 1720, and he opens the Haymarket. Now, the Haymarket is a theater that becomes another one of the majorly important theaters in Restoration England. I'll tell you why in just a little bit. Right? So by 1723, you see on the list here, the pantomime becomes the most popular form. Like I said, John Rich had started in 1714, making it a mainstay of his theater, and that's what popularized it. By 1723, it is the most popular form. John Rich establishes the accepted pattern, like I was talking about earlier, and he begins to really boost the sort of fervor for pantomime. Actually, even other theater companies that didn't want to do pantomime kind of had to acquiesce to it because that's what everybody wanted. So that happened. 1728, John Rich also then produces The Beggar's Opera, written by a man named John Gay. This is the first ballad opera. If you are familiar at all with the Threepenny Opera from Bertolt Brecht, it is the same story. Mac the Knife. If you've ever heard the song Mac the Knife, that's out of the Threepenny Opera, which is based completely on The Beggar's Opera. 1732, it says later John opens the Covent Garden Theatre. Now, if you recall, it had been open for a while, but they moved out of it to go back to the new theater. John Rich then reopened that. So it really probably should say reopens the Covent Garden Theatre and sort of reestablishes there, and he managed it for a bit. Now, looking at the Licensing Act of 1737, this is kind of an important thing. And here's how it happened. Robert Walpole was getting sick and tired of being lampooned in local theater productions. Him, the government, all sorts of things. These people were just slandering the government and Robert Walpole himself a lot. And he got tired of it. So he goes to Parliament and he pushes this through quickly, this Licensing Act. Now everything's got to be licensed by the Master of Revels. Now everything has to be censored. On top of that, this is how much, how serious this guy was about how much damage he felt that they were doing. Okay, it was lewd behavior of theater goers. It was lewd behavior of the actors themselves. It was political ramification linked to dramas that were performed on the stage. All unlicensed theater managers continued to challenge the aristocracy, but they put a vice grip on it, and they said no performance can be done that has not been approved by the Master of Revels. And they closed a lot of theaters. Matter of fact, they closed a large percentage of them. What they ended up doing, Lord Chamberlain himself had to oversee all plays and productions. And it also gave the Lord Chamberlain the authority to license all of the plays and any theaters. But what they ended up doing is they just went, well, you know what? We're not going to even license new theaters. What's going to end up happening is there are 2 theaters now licensed to work in London, and that is the Drury Lane and the Covent Garden. And that is it. Any other theater is an illegal theater. And that is where we get the term legitimate theater from. It comes from there. If it was not the Covent Garden, not the Drury Lane, and it was not a play that had already been approved by the Lord Chamberlain, it was illegitimate theater. If it had its approval and was it being done in one of those houses, it was legitimate theater. That's where we get that term from, if you've ever heard it before. So that is the Licensing Act of 1737. Put a stranglehold on theater. Next, you see in 1751, William Hallam sends a troop to America. Now, 1751, 1752, really. He used to work as a theater. It was the Goodman's Field Theater. Hallam ran that, and it was falling apart because, well, it was not a legitimate theater. So he was losing money. So he took whatever he had left, sold the costumes, props, all that kind of stuff, and he took that money and he sent his entire troop over to America. The company was being run by his brother, Lewis Hallam. And in 1752, they reach America, and that is the beginning of professional theater in America. Now, by 1760s, all the little towns and whatnot around London are starting to get a little pissed off because the only legitimate theater that exists is in London at these two theaters. So they start petitioning the Crown so that every small town or city can have its own theater royal, legitimate theater. And that's what starts happening around the 1760s as the Crown starts authorizing theaters in other towns. Now, last year before playwrights, you see 1766, Samuel Foote granted a license to produce plays at the Haymarket. How can that happen? Because the only legitimate theaters are Covent Garden and Drury Lane. This is really cool. This is why theater history is fun and exciting, right? Samuel Foote's a playwright. Kind of a dork. He's the kind of guy that thinks you're bigger buddies than you really are. He thinks that he's that kind of buddy with the Duke of York, who thinks he's kind of a jackass in reality. So Samuel Foote is palling around with the Duke of York at one point in time, and the Duke of York says, they start talking about riding horses, equestrianism. And of course, Samuel Foote talks about his skill at equestrianism and all that kind of stuff. And so the Duke of York goes, really? I'll let you ride my new mare. He says, fine. And it was a dangerous horse, like a crazy dangerous horse. So he put him on it anyway, and the horse threw him, broke his leg so badly that it had to be amputated. It was a prank. It went too far. Samuel Foote went to the Crown, griping about the Duke of York's prank and how they were going to give him some sort of restitution. And what they gave him was summer use of the Haymarket Theater that John Potter had opened 46 years before. And that is how there became a third Crown-authorized theater in London, by a prank. The cool thing was that Samuel Foote got the license for that for his lifetime. Or for, actually, it was a lifetime patent. So he sold it to someone else. As a man named George Coleman. He sold it in 1777. And George Coleman then, it just kept going on for lifetimes. And it kept going there until after 1843, and making it the third licensed theater. So, very interesting manner in which we got a third theater in London to be licensed to be used. So, I'm going to end this one here, and we'll pick up with playwrights and theater architecture in the next section.